Maegovanen guain melin aior. Tolokoren lastobethnin. Welcome everybody. I am glad that you've made it this far. It's nice to know that I'm not the only complete nerd out there. I think that this is a little bit of me wanting to share some of the stuff that I've learned, wanting to build a bit of a community of people who are interested in this kind of thing, and also just trying to convince myself that I haven't been wasting my time. That would be nice. So yeah, thanks for everyone that's shown interest. This has been something that I kind of started doing in lockdown and in building a new character for myself for LARP. I just really wanted to do something different, keep my brain active, and learning a fake language seemed like a really good idea. This video is not so much a first lesson as it is a bit of an introduction, a bit of a what is Sindarin, a bit of a what to expect from the language and what to expect from this video series that I'm going to be putting together. We're just going to dive into a bit of history to set the background of what Sindarin is and what it isn't, and what we're going to try and do with it, or what I'm doing with it anyway. So Sindarin, or Sindarin, is one of many languages that was invented by J.R. Tolkien. He began inventing languages at a very young age, actually, which is kind of insane. I think he was younger than my eldest daughter, when he started inventing languages. Kind of a weird kid, but, you know, we love him for it. It's actually been said that he created Middle-earth to have a place for his languages to exist. So the languages actually came before the books, which is kind of crazy. And we'll go into it a bit later, but he actually continued to be tweaking those languages even up till like the day and the week that he died. He was still making notes and annotations and changing things, which is one of the reasons that it's actually quite hard to peg down exactly what these languages are. But yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background. This is going to be just skimming the surface of some of these things, but within the history of Arda, which is the realm in which Middle-earth exists, as well as Valinor and Beleriand, Sindarin and its precursor Quenya are the two most commonly spoken Elven languages. They're the ones that people kind of know. There are a bunch of different dialects and other languages from Tolkien's Legendarium, but those are the two main ones that people kind of know. Quenya is the language of the Noldor, the High Elves who lived in Valinor, the Undying Lands, and who travelled back to Middle-earth in pursuit of Morgoth when he stole the Silmarils from Feanor, who was Galadriel's cousin. The elves had been instructed by the Valar, who are kind of the demigods of Arda, who are kind of helped to form the earth, but are still subservient to Iluvatar, who is the god of gods, who most of these things are not mentioned in the movies. You need to kind of read the Silmarillion, or I don't think they're even really touched on in the books of the Lord of the Rings. It's all background stuff, but it's all actually quite important to the overarching story. The elves had been instructed by the Valar not to leave the Undying Lands and not to pursue Morgoth to Middle-earth. The Noldor, who were led by Feanor and his sons, ignored the Valar. They were obsessed with getting the Silmarils back, and they decided to travel to Middle-earth anyway. They reached the coast where the Teleri elves lived, and the Teleri were shipbuilders and sailors, and the Noldor said to the Teleri, "Give us your ships." The Teleri said no, the Valar have said don't go, and so the Noldor started taking their ships by force, and when the Teleri fought back, they got butchered, basically. This was called the first of the kinslayings. There's a whole lot more to say about this. I don't know that I will really go into too much of the background lore. There are some great lore-based YouTubers that I have watched pretty much all of their stuff. I'll put some links in the description. Men of the West, Nerd of the Rings, and The Broken Sword are my favourite ones. They've got great things you can watch and learn about pretty much all of the major topics in the Silmarillion without actually having to sit down and slog your way through it. It's hard to get through. I love it, but it's a slog. But yeah, we're not really here for a history lesson about Middle-earth. I'm just giving you some of the background for the language, and the point of that is that the Sindar, or the Grey Elves, were relatives of the Teleri who stayed in Middle-earth. They didn't live in Valinor or in the Undying Lands. And when they learned about the kinslaying of the Noldor having butchered the Teleri, well, not all the Teleri, but a bunch of the Teleri who were close relatives of the Sindar, they developed a great amount of animosity towards the Noldor and actually shunned their language, and thus Sindarin by the Third Age, which is when the Lord of the Rings is set, is the primary language spoken by the elves in Middle-earth. Most of the Noldor are kind of dead or returned to Valinor by that stage anyway. There are a few notable ones like Galadriel and, Elrond is descended from the Noldor, but is not technically, he never lived in the Undying Lands. Unimportant, the important thing is that Quenya is basically only really spoken in ancient texts and spells, and the Astari, who are the wizards, and some of the surviving Noldor are kind of the only ones who really remember Quenya as a language, which is why there's probably, you can learn Quenya as well. I just find that Sindarin is, I'm not going to say better, it's just more widely spoken in the movies and in the books. You don't see as much Quenya, so you might not be as familiar with it as you would be with Sindarin. So yeah, that's kind of a very condensed history. I don't think I got anything wrong there. I have just barely touched on a lot of those things, but it kind of gives you a background of what the language is and where it fits in the world of Middle-earth. Yeah, if you're interested in those, in the histories, watch those YouTube channels. I listen to them all the time. I've listened and re-listened to a lot of those videos, and I really love those guys. Okay, so what Sindarin is not. Sindarin is not a complete language. Just to set expectations before we start this, Sindarin is not actually, there aren't enough words in Sindarin for it to be considered a language that you can just speak every day, all the time. There are heaps of words, and it is fantastic. It's most commonly a written language, which means it is quite hard to find examples of people speaking it. But yeah, of the videos that are out there, I've not really found, I have found that because of this kind of process that the language has gone through, because Tolkien was constantly changing things, there's different versions of the language, and yeah, it's not a commonly spoken language, so there isn't necessarily consensus on how things are supposed to be done, how things are supposed to be pronounced. There certainly is consensus within different communities, but different communities have different ideas about how things should be done. And then, between the making of The Lord of the Rings and the making of The Hobbit, Christopher Tolkien actually released a bunch of information based on writings that were left behind by J.R. Tolkien after his death, which actually completely changed the understanding of the language. And so the language that is spoken in the Hobbit movies is different from the language that is spoken in the Lord of the Rings movies. I mean, it's the same language, but there are differences. So because it's not really a complete language and there are only so many words that are actually in it, you may find that you kind of have to be creative in your interpretation of how to convey the message that you're trying to get across. I've found it interesting in looking at all the different phrases and things that people put together, and just the way that they kind of will manipulate the existing words so that they can say what they're trying to say. One one thing to understand about language in general is it's only as good as the understanding that you get from the other person that you're speaking to. Which is one of the reasons that sharing all this with all of you who are interested, it's great for me to learn it. It's a lot of fun. I love it. But if other people don't understand it, then what's the point? You can't talk to anyone. And that's been one of the problems that I've had with learning other languages in the past. So the language that we're kind of dealing with, from all the stuff that I've been able to gather together, is essentially called Neo-Sindarin, which is obviously Neo-Sindarin. It's the modern interpretation of Sindarin, and this is the language that is essentially spoken in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings movies, because there wasn't enough information given by Tolkien to create the language that they needed to be able to translate the dialogue that they wanted for the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies. And so they actually did get language experts. They used as much of Tolkien's work as possible, but they did kind of tweak things and add things that were in a similar vein to kind of fill out the language a bit more so that they could actually translate the dialogue that they wanted to see on the screen. We don't tend to refer to it as Neo-Sindarin, we just say Sindarin, but it is the language that we're kind of looking at is not exclusively Tolkien's language. It is Tolkien's language with stuff built on top of it so that it can be more of a functional language. So some of it is non-canon, but if you want to actually be able to make proper sentences and things outside of just re-quoting phrases that are in the books, then you kind of need to have those extra building blocks on top of it. So because Sindarin has been around as long as the Lord of the Rings has been around, and people have been studying it for as long, and some people get really into it. There are highly intellectual people that spend far too much time, maybe. I'm one to talk, learning these things and studying Tolkien's work, and then, they'll have an idea of exactly, being able to speak what they believe is the language that Tolkien made, and then there are extra things that Tolkien did which changed that understanding. So depending on when somebody has learned the primary stuff for the language, they might have a different interpretation of things. So learning Sindarin is fun for an intellectual exercise, but it's kind of super difficult to be concise with. And different people will have different interpretations and different ideas about how things should be pronounced, which words should be used where, what order they should be used in. At the end of the day, we're doing it for fun, and if you can understand each other, then great. So just a quick background about my experience, who I am, what I'm doing. My dad read The Hobbit to me when I was about 5 or 6 years old, before I could actually really read myself. I first read it for myself in 1993. When I was 9, I remember doing a book report on it for school. And I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time in 1997. I tried to read it before that point, but it was a bit of a slog as a very young person, and so I kind of set it aside and came back to it a few years later, when I was about 13. I remember reading it. I absolutely loved the characters. I loved the story. I loved the history. I loved the languages. I was particularly taken by the character of Legolas. I loved the elves. I just loved their culture. I loved who they were, and what they did. I didn't really have a lot of luck with languages throughout my schooling. I started studying languages in year 4 because, other people weren't doing it at that time, but I was in an advanced class in primary school, and so they started us doing French in year 4. I continued that in year 5 and actually started getting quite good at it, but then for some reason, when I was in year 6, they decided to get us to do German, which was really difficult and a massive change, and the teacher that I had wasn't very good. And then in year 7, the high school that I went to for the first 3 terms of Year 7, we did Japanese term 1, Italian term 2, and then French in term 3, and then you were supposed to kind of pick the one that you liked the most out of those to do in term 4. But I just went to a different school and did French again. But yeah, so I was like French for some time just to get familiar with it, and then German, and then Japanese, and then Italian, and then back to French. And by the time I got back there, I could not remember anything that I had done when I was in Year 4 and 5. I actually came top of my class, I think, in my French exam at the end of Year 7, but I hated languages by that stage. Just my brain was too full, and just I hadn't been able to focus on one thing long enough to get good at it. So I didn't take languages as an elective. I kind of wish I had. I've always wanted to be able to speak more languages. I find it absolutely fascinating, people speaking other languages. As I said before, I started learning Russian a little while ago, which was for LARP, just because I was playing a character that was a vampire and I wanted to get the accent right, and I wanted to be able to have some basic phrases and words that I could throw into my characterization, which would give it that kind of authentic feel. But again, because I was the only person doing it, nobody understood what I was saying, so I couldn't really converse with anyone, and that meant that I didn't really develop the language. I couldn't use it regularly, and yeah, I stopped studying, and at this stage I don't remember too much of what I learned, but it was a lot of fun, and I picked it up really quickly, which is partially what gave me the courage, I suppose, to pick this up and actually put time into learning something that I really wanted to do, like this Sindarin language. Because of my love for Legolas as a character back when I was 12, 13, when I first read The Lord of the Rings, when I first started LARPing, when I first started playing D&D, all my characters were elves. When I first started LARPing, I really wanted to make an elf character, but at the time I didn't really have access to the funds or to get kind of good prosthetics and things to really do that kind of a character justice. And so I kind of set it aside because I didn't want to kind of start doing something and not really do it well. But at this stage of my LARP career, I've been doing it for about a decade. I have a lot more of a disposable income now, and given the amount of effort that I've put into some of my costumes for conventions and things like that, I thought, let's make an elf. Let's do what you actually wanted to do a decade ago. And I have I've put together a costume that I'm really quite proud of. Naturally in lockdown, we've not had the opportunity to go to games. So I thought, let's spend some time learning a language to make the character, to really flesh the character out. And I really wanted to make the character kind of stuck up, a little bit mysterious, and also to be able to insult people behind their back. So I started researching how to actually speak this language that I'd kind of thought about for a really long time. Tracking down resources to try and learn Sindarin has been a mission. I thought it was going to be fairly easy. I thought it would, given the popularity of Lord of the Rings and things, didn't mean to rhyme there, because of the popularity of the Lord of the Rings, I had thought that it would be easy to track down this kind of stuff, but it's really not been. After a lot of researching and kind of dead ends, I eventually did find a How to Learn Sindarin textbook, if we can call it that, which I have been working my way through. It's been really interesting, but it's clearly written by kind of a linguist. I am not a linguist, but I have kind of immersed myself in everything that there is to learn from this. I have looked up just about every video on the internet of people speaking the language, which has been really hard because a lot of them pronounce things differently. A lot of them use different words to mean the same thing. It's, as I said before, there's different... None of them I wouldn't really say any of them are wrong. They're just differently right. Depending on when they learned it, where they've got the information from, it's a hard language to nail down. So yeah, there are courses that you can do in Sindarin. I found some online through Discord that you can do, but most of them are in America or the UK, and being in different time zones, that's really hard. So I have kind of been going it alone, and in pursuit of that, I decided that what I really needed, which I couldn't find anywhere, is a video or a sound file of somebody speaking the language and giving the translation so that I can learn the words and have that repetition. And I could not find anything like that anywhere online. You've either got people sort of giving you phrases and then a translation and then moving on to the next phrase. Or there's a couple of videos that I found of people just speaking to you in Sindarin. Which, I mean, the most amazing thing is there's one where there's a guy who's speaking entirely in Sindarin. He does not speak English at all in the video, and yet he's doing a tutorial on how to pronounce the vowels and the consonants in Sindarin. But if you can even understand what he's saying, then clearly you don't need that tutorial. So I don't understand what the point of that is. So yeah, I wanted to put these videos together for myself so that I can listen to them, so that I can familiarize myself with the language. And I just kind of thought, if I'm interested in doing this for myself, maybe there's other people that might be interested in it as well. And if I can do a good enough job, then maybe we can learn together and speak to one another. And yeah, if you want to go down this rabbit hole with me, that's fine. If you don't, that's cool too. I will insult you behind your back in Sindarin. Yeah, so here we are. And just to clarify up front, I'm not a linguist. I'm not a Tolkien scholar. I'm not an elf. I'm just a guy who has, well, I won't say I have too much time on my hands. I've used my time perhaps unwisely. I'm a LARPer. I'm interested in languages. I've studied a few, not terribly deeply. I now know more Sindarin than I ever did French. I just wanted to do this so that I can learn a fancy made-up language, insult people in Elvish, and yeah, just maybe if you want to come on that journey with me, then we'll maybe one day have a conversation in one of the sexiest languages ever invented. Yeah. If that sounds good to you, come for the journey with me. Use my resources. I will link all of the resources that I have been studying in the description of this video. I'll also put in links for those History of Middle-earth channels that I've really enjoyed watching if you're into that kind of thing. Yeah, happy to plug those guys as much as possible because they've really made my job a lot more bearable by just listening and learning all the stuff that I've ever wanted to know about Middle-earth. Yeah, come for the ride. Nova ir nin melin. And remember, avos anoruith, vigur alfrin.